Hi everyone, welcome. I've got a couple worm bins out here on the bench that I'm preparing to feed. These systems have European night crawlers living in them, and it's been a couple weeks since they were last fed, 14 days. The two systems that you see in front of you, the older one here is 269 days of age, and the younger one is 245 days of age. They've been fed 26 and 21 times. And the unusual thing about this system over here within the younger bin is the presence of a compostable bag that you can see me tugging on over here. I try not to be too tough on the bag because I'd really prefer to see if the worm bin itself is capable of breaking it down as opposed to me ripping away and tearing at it. We've been observing some holes developing on the compostable bag, but I'm pretty sure that those holes are holes that I generated by being a little bit rough with the bag, because it seems unlikely that the worms are actually breaking the bag down, because otherwise I think we'd see a whole lot more progress, because those holes that we see on this thing are holes that have been present for quite some time now. The bag is really the main novel item when it comes to the feedings of these two systems here. For a while, on the other hand, we were kind of focusing more on the conditions of the bins, which we classified as being overly damp. So we did sort of focus more on recovering from an overly damp condition in these systems for a few check-ins. But during the most recent check-in, I mean the last check-in 2 weeks ago, we did sort of take these systems out of overly damp classification, and we did sort of consider them as being in really nice shape at this point. And by being left uncovered for the most part, with the exception of the coffee filters that were just indicating where we last fed, these systems have just been sitting here open to the air, allowing for the material out on the top surface to become somewhat dry. But as you can see, once you dig down even a little bit down into the material, it's damp enough to support plenty of worm traffic. So luckily these bins are holding up pretty good. With the humidity that we've been getting in my area lately, it does seem like leaving bins completely uncovered is totally doable without any risk of the systems becoming overly dry. If it were winter time and if my heat were running, then it would be a different story for sure, because the dry air in my house, which results from the heating system blowing forced hot air all winter, does produce extremely dry air in the house. But once the furnace stops running and there's no more heat, the humidity from outside starts to creep in. And I live in the state of New Jersey here in the United States, where humidity is pretty common. So the high humidity in the air does tend to limit the amount of evaporation that occurs in the worm bins. So here too you can see we didn't really have to go very far, perhaps an inch or not even, before we hit material that's already loaded with worms cruising around in it. It's really kind of interesting, if these systems were left uncovered like this in the winter time, the material would become so dry on the surface. In fact, if I were to cover up even a couple bins that I just fed not too long ago, the last two systems I fed even, where I had only newspaper covering the systems, it did seem to me almost like even that one single sheet of newspaper covering things was enough to send things into an overly damp situation. The way we remedied the overly damp situation in these systems was by running a fan, and just the fan over the course of a number of days is blowing across the top surface, resulting in nice dry material out on the top. And then periodically I would just come in and blend that somewhat drier material down into the bin, combining it with the more moist material that's down low. And then eventually the material all kind of equalizes as far as moisture content. And to me, the measure of material that's nice in a worm bin is its ability to just crumble and flow the way this stuff does. If it was so damp that it was just sticking together into mud clumps, then I would consider it as overly damp. And then we would go back to maybe, you know, exposing it to the moving air of a fan blowing across. But it does seem like right now we've got what I would consider to be almost ideal conditions in these bins, with the material nice and crumbly and loose, still holding enough moisture content to make the worms quite comfortable to just be in it no matter where they want to be, even very close to the surface where things would normally be a little bit drier in bins that are just, you know, open to the air like this. So I'm just trying to get these little itsy bitsy worms off my glove. I always do really like seeing lots and lots of little tiny worms on my glove, even though they are a little bit of a nuisance. I just worry a little bit that I'm gonna knock one off and have it end up on the floor or something like that. I just thought that I would go to the shelf behind me to grab some of my prepared bedding, but every time I sort of leave the, you know, the bins, I feel like I'm gonna possibly lose one of these little hitchhikers, and even a little tiny worm like this on the tip of my finger would be a shame to lose because of carelessness. So I'd prefer just to try to make sure none of them are falling off my gloves onto the ground into a perilous situation. So before we drop in today's feeding, I wanted to just include a little bit of extra bedding. You know, these systems are kind of getting up there in age, so I might want to, you know, consider withholding the application of more bedding at some point, and then allow the worms really to just to work down whatever still remains in the bins, and then eventually start to drive these systems towards harvest. But I think we've still got a little ways to go before that would happen. Sometimes I move on to that phase once I start to sense that the capacity of the systems has been reached. We're not really at that point in these bins, so we could probably just keep going, but I don't know. It just felt to me like maybe we would want to possibly harvest these castings, get these worms working somewhere else at some point. So I'm going to start applying their food onto this application of fresh bedding. I've got a whole bunch of this breadcrumb that my mom found on her shelf in her pantry, which, according to her recollection, was pretty old. And even though it doesn't smell weird, and even though it's dry and everything like that, it could probably just be used and would be fine. She just decided she would kind of err on the side of caution and assume that maybe at this point it's a little bit too old, so she, you know, donated it to the worm farming cause over here. And I need to get her that cool metal can back at some point, so once it's empty I'm going to be returning it to her. It's kind of interesting how this old pumpkin stem has a worm sort of burrowed down into it. I just thought I'd be able to knock the little guy off, but every time I touch the worm it retreats further down into the pumpkin stem. I guess I'll put it in upside down because some of the stuff I wanted to drop in next has been in the freezer. So I just worried about exposing the poor little worm to some freezing food. Before we drop in those yummy foods though, I'm also going to plop in this compostable bag so that it's caught right between the breadcrumbs and the fruits and veggies that we're adding. Maybe it's all fruits. The strawberries are fruits for sure. Tomato though I thought was veggie, but then I think I was corrected. So maybe these are actually all fruits. Quite a nice colorful feeding. Sometimes when you put tomatoes into a worm bin, the worms are just unable to breach the skin of the tomato. So you'll come back after some period of time and find that they've not even touched the tomatoes yet. I remember having tomatoes where I would come back in 2 months later and I would still be able to kind of squeeze the tomato and it still was holding pressure with the skin not yet broken. So what I did before coming down here, after I pulled these things out of the freezer, I took a little knife and I punctured each of the skins of each of these tomatoes. So I carefully went around and I poked the skin so that the moisture content of each of these tomatoes would be exposed to the worms, and then even if it's just through a tiny access hole, they would, you know, make their way into each of these tomatoes and start enjoying the delicious, moist, fruity goodness of the food. So you might notice how the dust coming off this pulverized eggshell is sort of flying about. That's because I do have the fan blowing, and it's mainly because it's kind of a warm day and I'm using it to keep myself cool while I'm down here maintaining my worm bins. But just a, you know, word of caution, if you are using eggshells as grit in your worm bins, you got to be careful about that airborne eggshell dust, because once that stuff gets in your lungs, it's never leaving, and it's not a good thing. So you want to avoid inhaling that sort of stuff. Every time that happens in my wormery, I'm always kind of facing the other way to let that stuff blow away and not hit me in the face. So I'm going to see about trying to bury the feeding area in such a way that I still see a little tail sticking out of the compostable bag so that it's obvious where it's at, so we can go right for it next time we check in here. I'm kind of assuming that the material throughout these bins is probably in just as good shape as it was down the feeding zones. Usually I'll examine the outskirts of my bins just to make sure of that, to confirm it. But I mean, with these systems being uncovered and even the feeding areas being as nice and loose and crumbly as they were, it does seem to me like it's safe to assume that even the outer edges of the bin are probably in good shape and not in any sort of a situation where there'd be a reason for concern. Yeah, you could see even the number of worms in the material is a good sign that everything's in great shape. Sometimes the worms do mob around material that is possibly a little bit overly damp. So sometimes the presence of a lot of worms is an indication that you're starting to approach that point where things are too damp. But here, I don't think that's the case. There's certainly enough moisture in the material to make the stuff nice and cozy for plenty of worms to want to be in, as you can see. But none of it clumps, so there's certainly no reason for concern here. And you know, what the heck, since we already examined the the edge closer to you, why don't we just do it over here too? I've been trying to make this a habit anyway. For a while there, I would sometimes forget to check the outer edges of my bins, and then sometimes many feedings would even go by without me checking the outer edges of the bins, and sometimes you're in store for a little bit of a surprise going on out there on the outer edges by not checking in on them periodically. So I think it's for that reason that I've kind of turned it into something of a habit. Not to mention that, you know, towards the end of the video, when you're expecting virtually no more worm spottings, it is kind of fun to till around out there and eventually, even towards the end of the bin, wind up seeing a whole bunch of worms. Because after all, that's why we're watching these videos, right? Worm spottings. Alright, I think we're done here. Not much for me to do as far as covering up, because the only coverings we're using over here are the feeding zone indicators, these coffee filters. And since things are pretty dry, with these things being exposed to the air, these coffee filters should hold up. If there was some sort of a plastic covering and moisture recirculating, these pieces of paper would get nibbled away gradually by the worms, but by being exposed to the air, they're dry. They don't receive hardly any worm activity at all, so they're going to last a while. Alright everyone, that's it for the check-in with these European night crawlers. Both systems doing really nicely, if you ask me. And I guess I broke my glove. So no need to clean these gloves off. I'll be throwing them in the trash. But like I said earlier, I just got to make sure I've got all the hitchhikers removed. I'll take care of that once the camera stops rolling. Really quick though, before I go, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.